Imagine a man whose name means shooting star or panther crossing the sky, a man who seemed to blaze across the horizon of history with the brightness of a celestial fire, illuminating a path of unity for peoples who had never before stood together. Imagine a leader who could walk into the council of rival tribes, speak with a voice that moved men to tears and to war, and convince them that their only hope lay in setting aside generations of hatred and joining hands against a common enemy. Imagine a warrior who refused to sign treaties he did not believe in, who fought not for personal glory, but for the survival of a way of life, and who, even in death, became a symbol of resistance that would echo through the centuries. This was Tecumseh, the Shawnee leader who united native tribes, and he was the visionary warrior incarnate. The story of Tecumseh is the story of a man born into a world that was collapsing around him, who dedicated his life to holding back the tide, and who very nearly succeeded. It is a story of oratory that could sway thousands, of a brotherhood with a prophet, of a confederacy that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, and of a death that marked the end of an era. At its heart lies a single burning vision, that native peoples must stand together or fall separately, that the land belonged to all and could not be sold by any single tribe, and that resistance was not merely a political choice, but a sacred duty. Tecumseh was born around March 1768 in a Shawnee village along the Scioto River in what is now Ohio, probably near the present-day city of Chillicothe. The precise date is uncertain, but the circumstances of his birth were themselves prophetic. He was born into the Panther clan of the Kispoco division of the Shawnee people, and his name, Tecumseh, or more properly, Tecumseh, signified a celestial panther, a shooting star, a sign from the heavens. Later stories would claim that a meteor streaked across the sky at his birth, a portent of the fiery path he would walk through life. His father, Puckeshinwau, was a war chief of the Kispoco, a man who had fought to defend Shawnee lands against the encroaching British and American colonists. His mother, Methoataski, belonged to the Pecowee division and the Turtle clan, and may have had Creek ancestry as well. Together, they represented the wandering history of the Shawnee people, who had been scattered across the continent by the wars of the previous century and were only now reuniting in their ancestral homeland of the Ohio Valley. That homeland was under threat even before Tecumseh could walk. The Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768 had opened Kentucky to British settlement, though the Shawnee and other tribes had never agreed to the cession. Conflict simmered and finally boiled over in 1774, when Virginia militia under Lord Dunmore marched against the Shawnee. At the Battle of Point Pleasant on October 10th, Puckeshinwau was killed, cut down while fighting to protect the land his son would one day fight to reclaim. Tecumseh was only 6 years old. The death of his father marked the beginning of a childhood defined by loss and displacement. During the American Revolution, the Shawnee allied with the British, raiding American settlements in Kentucky. But the Americans struck back hard. In 1779, when Tecumseh was about 11, his family was forced to flee their village as General George Rogers Clark's militia burned Shawnee towns along the Scioto. They moved to the Mad River, near present-day Springfield, Ohio, only to be driven out again when Clark returned in 1782. Tecumseh's mother, overwhelmed by the constant warfare and the loss of her husband, eventually left the Shawnee and moved west to live with the Creeks, leaving her children in the care of their older sister, Tecumseh. But Tecumseh was not left without a mentor. His older brother, Cheeseekau, a rising war chief, took the boy under his wing, teaching him to hunt, to fight, and to understand the ways of the warrior. Under Cheeseekau's tutelage, Tecumseh grew into a young man of remarkable physical presence and quiet intensity. He was not the largest of men, but he carried himself with a dignity that commanded respect. He spoke little, but when he spoke, men listened. And he watched everything, learning the arts of war and diplomacy with a patience that belied his years. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris ended the American Revolution, and the victorious United States claimed all lands north of the Ohio River as its own. The native peoples of the region, who had never been consulted, were outraged. That summer, a great intertribal council convened at Lower Sandusky, where leaders from the Shawnee, Delaware, Wyandot, Iroquois, and other nations gathered to formulate a response. The Mohawk leader, Joseph Brant, a brilliant orator and diplomat, argued that the tribes must unite, that the land was held in common by all Indians, and that no single tribe had the right to cede territory without the consent of all. Tecumseh, only 15 years old, was present at this council. The idea of intertribal unity, of common ownership of the land, of resistance through confederation, burned itself into his consciousness. He would spend the rest of his life trying to make that vision a reality. And later generations would mistakenly credit him with originating ideas he had learned as a youth from Brant and other older leaders. For the next decade, Tecumseh honed his skills as a warrior. He fought alongside Cheeseekau in raids against American settlers on the Ohio River, learning the tactics of guerrilla warfare that would later make his confederacy so formidable he was disturbed by the cruelty he sometimes witnessed. Prisoners tortured, families destroyed, and developed a reputation for treating captives with mercy, an unusual quality in a warrior of his time. In 1792, Cheeseekau was killed leading an attack on Buchanan's Station near Nashville, and Tecumseh succeeded him as leader of the Kispoko Band. 2 years later, Tecumseh fought in the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the climactic engagement of the Northwest Indian War. A confederacy of tribes under the Shawnee chief Blue Jacket and the Miami chief Little Turtle had been resisting American expansion for years. But on August 20th, 1794, they were defeated by General Anthony Wayne's Legion of the United States. The battle was a disaster, not because the Indians fought poorly, but because their British allies at nearby Fort Miami refused to open the gates to fleeing warriors, leaving them to be cut down by American cavalry. The subsequent Treaty of Greenville in 1795 ceded most of Ohio to the United States, and the Confederacy collapsed. Tecumseh refused to sign the treaty. He would never sign a treaty ceding land, believing that such agreements were illegitimate when made by individual tribes without the consent of all. Instead, he moved his followers westward, first to the White River in present-day Indiana, and then, in 1808, to a site on the Wabash River near the mouth of the Tippecanoe Creek. There he and his younger brother established a village that would become the heart of his confederacy, Prophetstown. That younger brother, Lalawethika, had undergone a remarkable transformation. In his youth, he had been a drunken, shiftless man, unable to hunt or fight, an embarrassment to his family. But in 1805, he experienced a vision, or perhaps a series of visions, that changed him utterly. He emerged from a trance, claiming to have visited the spirit world, where the Master of Life had revealed to him the path to salvation. He took a new name, Tenskwatawa, meaning the open door, and began preaching a message of spiritual renewal and resistance to white influence. Tenskwatawa's teachings struck a chord among peoples who had seen their world turned upside down by disease, alcohol, and displacement. He called upon Indians to reject the corrupting influence of the whites, to give up liquor, to abandon European clothing and technology, to cease intertribal warfare, and to return to the old ways. He claimed that if they followed his teachings, the whites would be supernaturally removed from Indian lands, the buffalo would return, and the ancestors would rise again. His message spread like wildfire through the Great Lakes region, attracting followers from the Delaware, Wyandot, Ottawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Kickapoo, and many other tribes. Tecumseh recognized immediately the potential of his brother's movement. While Tenskwatawa provided the spiritual glue that held the Confederacy together, Tecumseh provided the political and military leadership. He began traveling constantly, visiting tribe after tribe, village after village, spreading the message of unity and resistance. He was not merely a warrior, but an orator of extraordinary power, a man whose words could move audiences to tears, could sway councils, could convince bitter enemies to stand together. Observers described his voice as melodious and compelling, his presence as commanding, his arguments as unanswerable. The core of Tecumseh's political message was simple and radical. The land belonged to all Indians in common. No single tribe, no individual chief had the right to sell it. All cessions of land to the United States were therefore illegitimate, and those who had signed such treaties had betrayed not only their own people, but all Indians everywhere. He urged the tribes to unite in a great confederacy that would present a united front to the Americans, refusing to recognize any land sales made without universal consent, and prepared to defend their remaining territory by force if necessary. This message directly challenged the policies of the United States government, which preferred to deal with tribes individually, exploiting divisions and buying land cheaply from compliant chiefs. The most aggressive proponent of this policy was William Henry Harrison, governor of the Indiana Territory, who had negotiated a series of treaties that transferred vast tracts of Indian land to the United States. In 1809, Harrison secured the Treaty of Fort Wayne, by which the Potawatomi, Miami, and Delaware ceded 3 million acres of land along the Wabash River, land that Tecumseh considered Shawnee territory. Tecumseh was furious. He began traveling even more extensively, building his confederacy with a sense of urgency that bordered on desperation. By 1810, he had gathered perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 warriors from tribes across the Northwest and into the South. Prophetstown had grown into a major intertribal community, home to thousands of Indians from dozens of nations, the largest Native American settlement in the Great Lakes region, and a symbol of the resistance movement. In August 1810, Tecumseh led a delegation of 400 warriors to meet with Harrison at Vincennes, the territorial capital. The meeting was tense, dramatic, and nearly erupted into violence. Tecumseh, dressed in traditional Shawnee clothing with a plume of eagle feathers, confronted Harrison before the gathered crowd. He denounced the Treaty of Fort Wayne, declared that the land belonged to all Indians, and warned that the Confederacy would resist any further American encroachment. When Harrison attempted to dismiss his arguments, Tecumseh's warriors rose to their feet, brandishing weapons, and the governor had to call out his guards to prevent a massacre. The conference ended without agreement, but Tecumseh had made his position unmistakably clear. Over the next year, Tecumseh continued his travels, now extending his reach to the southern tribes. In 1811, he journeyed to the lands of the Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Cherokee, hoping to bring them into his confederacy. He argued that the American threat was not a regional problem, but a continental one, that if the northern tribes fell, the southern tribes would be next. His message resonated with many, particularly among the Upper Creeks, who would later launch their own war against the United States. But other southern leaders, cautious and divided, refused to commit. While Tecumseh was in the south, disaster struck. On November 7, 1811, William Henry Harrison marched an army of about 1,000 men toward Prophetstown. Tenskwatawa, left in charge, was warned by his scouts but chose to attack preemptively, hoping to catch the Americans by surprise. The ensuing Battle of Tippecanoe was bloody but inconclusive. The Indians fought fiercely, inflicting heavy casualties, but eventually withdrew when their ammunition ran low. Harrison's army then marched into Prophetstown, burned it to the ground, and destroyed the food supplies stored for the winter. The defeat was a terrible blow to the Confederacy, and Tenskwatawa's reputation never recovered. Tecumseh returned to find his village in ashes and his brother discredited. He was furious with Tenskwatawa for attacking prematurely, but he did not abandon the cause. Instead, he began rebuilding, traveling again to rally his scattered followers. And as tensions between the United States and Great Britain escalated toward war, Tecumseh saw a new opportunity. When the War of 1812 broke out in June, Tecumseh immediately allied with the British. He understood that the British, with their bases in Canada, could provide the guns, ammunition, and supplies his warriors needed to resist American expansion. He traveled to Fort Malden in Amherstburg, Ontario, and offered his services to the British commander, Major General Isaac Brock. Brock, a brilliant and aggressive officer, recognized Tecumseh's qualities immediately. The two men formed a remarkable partnership. Brock described Tecumseh as the Wellington of the Indians, and Tecumseh reportedly said of Brock, "This is a man." Together, they planned a bold stroke against the American forces massing at Detroit. In August 1812, Brock and Tecumseh marched on Fort Detroit with a combined force of about 700 British regulars, Canadian militia, and 600 Indian warriors. They used clever deceptions, marching troops in circles to appear larger, having Tecumseh's warriors file through a clearing multiple times to exaggerate their numbers, to convince the American commander, General William Hull, that he was facing an overwhelming force. Hull, terrified of an Indian massacre if he resisted, surrendered the fort without firing a shot. It was one of the most humiliating American defeats in history, and Tecumseh's role in it cemented his reputation as a military leader of the first rank. The victory at Detroit brought a flood of new recruits to Tecumseh's cause. Warriors who had been wavering now flocked to join the Confederacy, and for a brief moment it seemed possible that Tecumseh's vision might actually succeed. But the tide soon turned. Brock was killed at the Battle of Queenston Heights in October 1812, and his replacement, General Henry Proctor, was a far less capable commander. Proctor lacked Brock's energy, his strategic vision, and his respect for his Indian allies. In 1813, the Americans gained control of Lake Erie after Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry's victory at the Battle of Lake Erie in September. Proctor, now cut off from his supply lines, decided to retreat eastward into Canada, abandoning Detroit and the territory Tecumseh had fought so hard to defend. Tecumseh was furious. At a council with Proctor, he delivered one of his most famous speeches, accusing the British general of cowardice and betrayal. "We must compare our father's conduct to a fat dog that carries its tail on its back, but when frightened, drops it between its legs and runs off," he said. But Proctor would not be swayed, and Tecumseh had no choice but to follow, hoping to make a stand somewhere else. The retreat ended on October 5, 1813, near Moravian Town on the Thames River in Ontario. Proctor's British regulars, numbering about 800, formed a thin line, with Tecumseh's 500 warriors anchoring the right flank on a swampy area. The American force, under William Henry Harrison, attacked with cavalry leading the charge. The British line broke almost immediately, Proctor fleeing with his men, leaving Tecumseh and his warriors to face the American onslaught alone. What happened next is shrouded in the fog of war and the mists of legend. Tecumseh's warriors fought desperately, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. At some point in the fighting, Tecumseh fell. Accounts differ on who killed him. Some credited Colonel Richard Mentor Johnson, who later became Vice President of the United States, with the campaign slogan, "Rumpsy Dumpsy, Rumpsy Dumpsy." Colonel Johnson killed Tecumseh. Others said he was shot by an unknown soldier, or perhaps by multiple assailants. His body was never identified, never recovered, never given a proper burial. He simply vanished into the earth he had fought so hard to defend. With Tecumseh's death, his confederacy collapsed. The warriors who survived the battle scattered, returning to their home tribes. Some continued to fight alongside the British for the remainder of the war, but without Tecumseh's unifying vision, the movement lost its momentum. Within a few years, the remaining tribal lands east of the Mississippi were ceded to the United States, and the peoples Tecumseh had tried to unite were forced westward across the great river, onto reservations in the unfamiliar plains. But Tecumseh's legacy did not die with him. In death, he became something more than a man. He became a symbol, a legend, a figure of resistance that would inspire generations to come. For Native peoples, he represented the possibility of unity, the dignity of refusal, the nobility of fighting for one's homeland. For white Americans, he became a romantic figure, the noble savage of popular imagination, a warrior whose courage and eloquence even his enemies had to admire. For Canadians, he was remembered as a heroic ally who died defending their soil against American invasion. The mythology that grew up around Tecumseh often obscured the real man. Stories multiplied about his birth under a shooting star, about his supernatural powers, about his death and the disappearance of his body. Poems were written, songs composed, paintings created, all celebrating the Shawnee chief who had defied the might of the United States. Richard Mentor Johnson built a political career on the claim of having killed him, while others disputed that claim, arguing over the precise circumstances of his death with an intensity usually reserved for fallen kings. What we know of the real Tecumseh is remarkable enough without the mythology. He was a man who rose from the ashes of a destroyed childhood to build the most formidable Native American confederacy in history. He was an orator whose words could move hardened warriors to tears. He was a diplomat who could persuade bitter enemies to stand together. He was a warrior who fought with courage but treated captives with mercy. He was a visionary who saw, decades before almost anyone else, that the only hope for native peoples lay in unity, in setting aside ancient hatreds and joining hands against a common threat. He was also a man of his time, shaped by the world he inhabited. He could be ruthless when necessary, ordering the execution of chiefs who cooperated with the Americans, threatening death to those who stood in his way. He was ambitious, not for personal power, but for his cause, and he was willing to sacrifice everything, his comfort, his safety, his life, for that cause. He formed an alliance with the British not out of love for the crown, but out of cold political calculation, recognizing that the enemy of his enemy might serve as a useful, if unreliable, friend. In the end, Tecumseh's vision failed. The Confederacy collapsed. The land was lost. The peoples he tried to unite were scattered across the continent. But failure is not the same as futility. Tecumseh showed what was possible, demonstrated that native peoples could set aside their differences and act together, proved that resistance was not hopeless. He inspired the Creeks in their own war, the Seminoles in their long struggle, and countless others who came after. And he left behind a name that still resonates across the plains and forests where he walked. Today, monuments mark his memory in Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and Ontario. His image appears on statues and plaques, in museums and historical sites. His speeches are studied by orators and his tactics by military historians. And on the reservations where his descendants live, his name is spoken with reverence. A reminder of a time when a Shawnee chief dared to dream of unity, when a shooting star blazed across the sky and tried to hold back the night. Tecumseh was the visionary warrior, the man who saw what others could not, who dreamed what others dared not, who fought when others would not. He was born in the shadow of defeat, lived in the path of an advancing tide, and died in the smoke of a battle he could not win. But in that death he achieved a kind of immortality that no surrender could ever erase. He remains, as he was in life, the shooting star, the panther crossing the sky, the man who tried to unite a world and very nearly succeeded.